Dello Heavy Duty Engine Oils. Proven engine protection at prices you can rely on, giving you even more reasons to choose Dello. Today we're back to talk about oil sampling some more. But I want to come at it from the angle of really how expensive is this and what sort of return can you expect on your investment? Is oil sampling really worth it for the small guys in the industry, or is this something that's only made for companies with really large fleets? Here from Chevron is Shelly Eckert again, and she's going to dive into this with us and give us some information about oil sampling and why it's applicable to the small guys as well. Well, Shelly, thank you so much for coming back on the dirt. It's so good to see you again.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It's always a treat. So this week, instead of talking about coolants, we're going to switch it up and we're going to go back to talking about oil sampling. And as I talked with the audience about in the intro, we've kind of come at oil sampling at a very high level in previous interviews, and we've kind of talked in generalities about an oil sampling program. Today, I really kind of want to take it to the granular level and really hone in on what an oil sampling program would look like for boots on the ground people. And so my first question is, realistically, what is an oil sampling program going to cost me per year? Is this an additional expense that I have to worry about and then worrying about, kind of making up for it on the back end, or is this something you can get into pretty affordably?
I think you can get into it pretty affordably. It's when you start talking about how you calculate the cost of the oil analysis, and sometimes the cost of the testing can look like this lab is really inexpensive, but this lab over here is much more expensive. Well, that could also be the quality of the two laboratories. When you start looking at the cost of it, you need to look at the return on investment, because it is an investment. You start looking into that factor of how much is it costing you when the piece of equipment is down and it's not working, which means it's not making money. How much is the parts to replace the part when there's a failure? The labor cost to make that repair. And the timing. It could be not planned at all. And then you have to scramble, right? But if you're doing oil analysis, that is actually should be built into this cost, right? So you're sending the sample into the lab, and it's like when you go to the doctor, right? You take a blood sample and the doctor comes back with, oh, you've got good cholesterol, or you have bad cholesterol, or you are lacking iron. Well, that's the same thing as sending a sample of an oil sample into the lab, because it's checking the health of the equipment.
That sounds great. And I do personally, I totally agree with everything you've just said. But I'm also very well versed with all the old salty dogs in the industry that change oil every X amount of hours, because that's the way we've done it since Grandpappy's time. And why am I going to pay for this newfangled oil sampling? Realistically, what ballpark numbers, I know there's going to be some variance, but ballpark numbers, what am I going to spend a year in sampling equipment and sending my samples off to a lab? Are we talking thousands of dollars?
It depends on how many sampling points you're taking, right? If you're sampling everything on yellow iron, right, it could cost you some money. But when you're talking about the return on investment, it's typically anywhere between $20 to one sample, or $54 to one sample. And then again, that all depends on the factoring of what you're putting in to determine it, because upper management's going to want to know, or the owner operator is going to want to know, how much is this going to cost me, right? When in reality, it's saving you money because you're being preventative and predictive.
Yeah, so that kind of so it's going to cost me roughly $20 to $50 a sample to send in. And for a smaller company, we may have 2 or 3 pieces of equipment, and you're going to do maybe a couple oil changes a year at most. So realistically, you're talking probably less than $500 for a couple pieces of equipment. And if you swell your fleet a little bit, you're still probably around the $1,000 to $1,500 mark. I mean, we're not talking a tremendous expense to set up an oil sampling program, especially if we're only talking oil sampling, correct?
That's correct. It's just not if you're looking at you start with how expensive is that piece of equipment, right? Because those big dump trucks in those mines, when you look like a little people from when we played when we were kids with the Tonka truck, that's in reality when you're down those mines, right? Those wheels are bigger, taller than me. So that piece of equipment's not cheap. So if you are looking and doing oil analysis, you could prevent a failure with not having that piece of equipment go down. Now, I will say there are spontaneous failures, right? So when you take a sample and you see metal shavings in that sample, you better find out what's wrong, because it's already too late. The lab, when they look at samples and when they look at the metals are measured by a small piece of your hair. So it's stuff that you can't see visually in a sample, unless it's really bad.
So where I go with that is I do think that the minds in a lot of these larger companies, I think they've really started to understand and grasp the concept, especially when you're talking about a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment. $50 is a drop in the bucket to be able to make sure that thing runs well, and to squeeze a little bit of extra life out of 50 gallons of oil in one of those huge engines. That's a thing. But I guess where I go is for small guys. It's these companies that may only have a couple pieces of equipment. You know, why do I need to worry about this? Why is this a big deal? And why should I even spend 50 extra additional dollars on this program?
Well, you kind of just hit upon it, right? So if you are not doing oil analysis, you're missing, again, the health of the equipment, right? And it's not just the health of the equipment, it's making sure that piece of equipment is up and running. If it's down, you're not making any money, right? You're not digging, you're not doing anything. And it could be on a job site when it goes down, and then you have to get it back to the shop. Then you've got a hauling expense, right? So there's all of these things that can add up, besides the parts and the labor, that can build to this return on investment of doing the oil analysis. And then you're being more proactive versus reactive, because essentially what you're doing, if you're not doing oil analysis, you're going to be doing reactive maintenance, not proactive maintenance.
And that it kind of segues me into my next question there, which is what kind of ROI can someone expect on an oil sampling program? And I guess that's kind of hard to pin down, just because the return is actually so massive compared to the expense of doing the sample.
The return is very much more bigger return by doing the oil analysis, right? But just the labs have these calculators, and they are some of them are more complicated than others, but the labs would work with even an owner operator to figure out how much am I actually going to save by spending this money, right? But it's going to be, total number of a piece of equipment. What are you sampling? The parts cost for a failure, the labor cost for a failure, as I've said before, loss of production, right? All of that gets added in, a cost of production. And then you just subtract the cost of the oil sample out. And there's your savings by doing one oil sample that's cheap.
So let's do some very, very high level math here. But before we get into that, I want to take a second to tell you about the sponsor of this video, Chevron Lubricants.
These cranes work around the clock for months at a time. If one of these engines ever goes down, it costs more than our reputation. Switching to Delo 600 ADF, it's been a game changer. We've had no issues with clogged DPFs. No regen lights, no cleaning, no replacements, nothing. This oil goes beyond anything we've ever used. I choose proven protection that keeps our cranes on the job. I choose Delo 600 ADF.
Let's say on the high end, we're paying $50 a sample, which I think we can both agree that's going to be on the high end. It's not going to cost you typically $50 a sample to send in. And let's say we're doing 10 samples a year on our one machine. Yeah. So we're spending $500 a year on our oil sample program for our one machine. It would take 4 or 5 years of oil sampling to equate what I'm going to spend just in parts and labor to get some sort of a large engine failure fixed on my machine. And I guess that's kind of where I go from a logic standpoint for a lot of these small guys, is they're going, well, that's just a totally unnecessary expense. But when you really think about it, over the course of, again, $50 a sample, that's on the high side. We're doing it 10 times a year, which no contractor is going to do an oil sample 10 times a year on their piece of equipment. So that's already an overinflated cost. But if I have to put my machine in the shop because it had some sort of an engine failure where we've got a valve issue, bearing issue, you've got something going on with one of your sleeves, that's going to be large money. You're probably $7,000 to $10,000 on those repairs. You're still not even close to touching what you spent on the oil sampling program, which could have prevented this massive problem in you putting the machine in the shop and all of the downtime that it's associated with it.
So I'm going to counter that with a question.
Okay.
in your guys' environment, right? You're moving dirt around, right?
Yep.
If you ingest dirt, what does that do to your engine?
It's abrasive and it's going to wear stuff out.
And it's going to wear it out, and the lab can detect that with running tests on it before it becomes a failure.
And so how often would you recommend sampling your oil a year to prevent that sort of an issue?
I would sample it every sample drain interval, right? And if the lab comes back with an abnormality or severity, then I would reduce the drain interval and resample. First of all, look to see if there's proactivity or anything that they can do to fix the problem, right? But then resample at half the drain interval, just to make sure that the problem was resolved. The first priority when you're looking at the health of the equipment is you want to keep it clean and free of contaminants, fuel, dilutions, coolant contamination, and of course, dirt. And you guys, you've got, for example, Caterpillar and John Deere are huge proponents of particle count cleanliness, keeping that oil clean and requirements of being clean. You can't get that until you send it into the lab to understand if you're keeping clean. Now, the other thing about this is the fact that it's not just elongating the life of the equipment, right? If you were to go and want to resell that equipment, you could use the oil analysis to show that you were taking care of that equipment, to increase the value of that equipment.
That's another good point.
Which is another reason.
Yeah. So
yes,
I guess to counter
warranty claims.
Oh, I guess that's true too. I didn't even think about warranty claims and the fact that you can back up that you've been doing the appropriate maintenance. It's not he said, she said. It's no, here's the legitimate documentation that we've been doing oil sampling. Everything's been above board up until this point.
Yes.
How much does personal history make a difference versus we've talked about it in the past, but for those who aren't familiar, these sampling programs, you're amassing data from across the entire globe, but more specifically, just within the United States. They're amassing these huge quantities of data on these machines and the oil and the wear that's going on. And so to counter another argument of, in my mind, well, we haven't been doing oil sampling and my machine's 5 or 6 years old, there's no point in starting now. How much does personal history matter versus the overall industry data? Can I still benefit on my 5-year-old machine by starting an oil maintenance or an oil sampling program now versus when I buy the machine?
That's a really good question, right? So when you buy the machine, you're still dealing with break and wear. And if that break and wear is abnormal, you would not know it until there's a failure, right? Because there isn't, especially when the componentry is changed. With new technology, they do all the testing, but when you actually get it out in the field, that's a totally different thing. So the lab will flag it if it's abnormal break-in too, which helps, especially with break-in wear. And then there's also, if you wanted to start 5 years into it, then the labs look at data, not just based on the hours on that oil, but they also look at the hours on the equipment. And they're going back and forth and looking to see if the piece of equipment is older, it's going to be tolerable of more wear trends versus a newer piece of equipment or half its way, 2 years into it. This is not rocket science, but it gives you a ton of information on that equipment, which is why you have the oil analysis programs all over the place for Caterpillar and John Deere and Komatsu and the lubricant companies. We all have our own oil analysis program. The filter companies have their own.
How much will oil sampling benefit an older piece of equipment? And when I say older, I'm talking like 1990, 1985. If I've got an old dozer out back, is that one that we just kind of put it out to pasture and go, this is not going to really benefit this piece of equipment, it's just too old for this to really make a difference? Or do the labs actually have data on those machines as well that it would be worth throwing some samples in there just to extend the life of this dinosaur? I mean, that's really where I go is, shouldn't that need more maintenance?
Yes, but you've also, do you need to routinely sample that older piece of equipment? No, you could probably get away with maybe once a year doing a health check, right? Or, you've got, I hate to say this because it's not scientific, you got a new noise going on, right? Just take a sample and send it into the lab. And, one sample is a picture in time. So a lot of the oil analysis is done based on trend analysis, right? So once you get past that first couple of samples, then you're looking to see. When I diagnose samples, I start with when was it last sampled? When is it currently sampled? How many hours are on the oil today? How many hours are on the equipment? And then I start looking at the data, right? And I'll use OEM limits or I'll use statistically derived limits. Now that I'm not in the field diagnosing samples anymore, how I do it now is I'll get a report and I'll look at the age of the equipment and the age on the oil. And then I will look at the commentary and then I look at what's flagged, right? I will admit there's times where I disagree with the diagnostics comments, but there's nothing wrong with sending it back to the lab and asking questions, because predominantly we use production labs. The reason why we use production labs is to keep the cost of the oil samples down. Now, if there was any questions on the oil sample, there's always what I would recommend is Southwest Research, because they have an oil analysis lab, and that's often used as a referee lab by these big production laboratories.
Interesting. So they're kind of the standard that everyone holds everything up to compare.
Yes and no. I mean, there are round robin samples that go through the laboratories to check the consistency between all of the labs. Cummins has an on-site lab as well, but it's all about data extraction and data comparison. It's the OEMs will go to the production laboratories to extrapolate data so that they can statistically analyze their performance by make and model and component. So they see value in it, but we have to feed them that data. Now, when that's done, there is no customer information provided. There's no traceability as who the customer sample it is. It's literally just the sample data and the make and the model. And that's if we have it, because that goes back to a good solid oil analysis program. You have to give the lab the make and the model of the component, not the tractor, the component.
So to kind of summarize what I've learned today, it sounds like, first of all, this is not some cost inhibitive thing. It's not something that you got to start setting money aside for in your maintenance program. We're literally talking for one piece of equipment, you're easily less than $500 a year. And when it comes to the actual sampling itself, more personal history obviously is far better because it allows the labs to do the trend analysis. But at the end of the day, don't let that stop you from starting oil analysis on your 5-year-old machine tomorrow, because it's still beneficial and you're now starting that trend analysis even though your machine is already 5 years old. Did I kind of interpret that all correctly?
Yes. So for example, 40% of engine failures are coolant maintenance problems. And if you're not testing it, you're not going to see it. Those engines get so hot that if you thought maybe a visual of a milky color would tell you that you've got coolant, that's not necessarily the case. You could be down in Florida and you've ingested water, or you've just gone through a hurricane and you ingested water, right? But generally speaking, the water in production will burn off the water and leave the chemical components, the salts, sodium and potassium, or a combination of the two. That clearly indicates to the lab this is a coolant leak. And they'll flag it that way.
Interesting.
And then you have to go find the source.
Yeah, exactly. But at least now you know that
Right?
there's a problem that you wouldn't have known otherwise.
That's correct. Because a lot of times if you'll change the oil, that coolant leak will go away for like 100 hours maybe, but it'll slowly accumulate back if you haven't fixed the problem.
Well, Shelly, thank you so much for all of the information, and thank you for, I mean, you're just a wealth of knowledge, and every time you come on here, it's like, okay, I'm learning a little bit more. Well, thank you again for Shelly taking the time to come on the show and really dive into some of the more gritty details of oil sampling and how it can benefit smaller companies like yours and mine. As always, I hope this helps you and your company. We'll catch you on the next episode of The Dirt.